So I
Yes.
hope this one's short for you,
Oh, hey,
but
Ellie.
how would you describe we're both predestined by God, and we also freely choose to be saved?
We're not predestined to talk about that tonight. I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah, okay.
We are both chosen but free. And let me just give you two quick thoughts on this. First of all, you can listen to the podcast we just did last week with Leighton Flowers. Leighton is really good on this issue. Just go back and listen to that. It's an hour long, so I can't sum the whole thing up. But just because God knows what we're going to do doesn't mean he's causing us to do it. I know the sun's going to rise in the east tomorrow, but does that mean I'm causing it to rise in the east? No. Knowledge does not necessarily imply causation. That's number one. Secondly, it's unavoidable for God, if he knows all things, that whenever he creates any universe he creates, he knows the outcome, right? Since he knows all things. If I create this universe, this is going to happen. This universe, this universe, this universe. Doesn't mean he's causing those things to happen, other than to say that he's the creator that enabled them to happen, but he's not overriding human free will to cause those things that occur in the universe, in those universes to happen.
Okay.
Thirdly, and Leighton makes this point in our podcast, that the word predestined, say used in Ephesians 1, doesn't mean that we don't have free will. It means that God has guaranteed the outcome. Like he gives the example, he says, suppose a king says, okay, I've got this fortress in the middle of our jurisdiction and there's a storm coming. Anybody that gets in the fortress is predestined to survive the storm. Anybody that stays out of the fortress is going to die. You decide. Now, when the people get in that fortress, they're predestined to live. Mm-hmm. People who stay out of that fortress are predestined to die. But who's making the choices? Mm-hmm. The people are, right? So you can think of predestination, if Leighton is right about this, you can think of predestination in Ephesians 1 as that kind of sense of the word of predestination. God is guaranteeing the outcome. If you're in Christ, you're predestined to be glorified. You're predestined to be with Jesus forever. If you're outside of Christ, you're not going to be with him. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
I have a follow-up question.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I've heard that, like, because we have a choice, it takes away from the sovereignty of God. How would you argue against that?
Yeah, that's nonsense. And here's why. If God wanted to overpower our free will, he could. But I think God is so sovereign that he can get his will done through our free will. It's the people that try and say the only way God can be sovereign is if he overpowers everyone's free will. Mm-hmm. How is that a sovereign God? Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm using another illustration that Leighton Flowers gives on this podcast where he says, let's suppose you're walking down the boardwalk and you see a guy playing chess and he's playing both sides. He's playing black and white. You know, he'd make a move, then he'd go to the other side of the chessboard and he'd move that, and then he'd go back to the other side, move that. And you ask him, well, why are you doing that? Because that's the only way I can guarantee the outcome. Mm-hmm. Then you go a little bit further down the boardwalk, you see another guy playing chess, and he is defeating every single chess player that becomes his opponent. The best chess players in the world, he defeats. Who has more power?
The second.
The second guy, right? Mm-hmm.
He's so good that he can even win no matter what the other guys do, what they freely do. That's more like God than the guy who's controlling everything on both sides of the board.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Okay?
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie.
In this discussion, Frank and the student tackle one of the most challenging topics in Christian theology, the relationship between predestination and free will. How can we reconcile the idea that God has a plan for everything with the belief that we, as humans, have the freedom to make our own choices? It's a question that has puzzled theologians for centuries, and it's definitely worth exploring. On one hand, the Bible teaches that God is sovereign and knows everything that will happen. For example, Ephesians 1:11 talks about God working all things according to the counsel of his will. This can lead to the belief in predestination, the idea that God has already determined who will be saved. On the other hand, the Bible also highlights human responsibility and the freedom to choose. Verses like Joshua 24:15, which challenges people to choose this day whom you will serve, emphasize the importance of free will. This tension between predestination and free will has led to different interpretations in Christian theology. For instance, Calvinism leans heavily on the idea of predestination, suggesting that God's grace is irresistible and that those he has chosen will inevitably come to faith. Arminianism, however, emphasizes free will, teaching that God's grace can be resisted and that people genuinely have the ability to accept or reject salvation. So can predestination and free will coexist? Many theologians think they can. One way to understand it is by thinking of God as existing outside of time. He sees all of history at once and knows what choices we'll make. But that doesn't mean he's forcing us to make those choices. We still make our own decisions, and those decisions have real consequences. Ultimately, this debate touches on the mystery of God's nature and our place in his plan. While we might not fully understand how predestination and free will work together, we can trust that God's wisdom is beyond our understanding and that his love and justice are perfect.